Now, we've heard a lot over the past day or so about the importance of cyber, both as an offensive and a defensive tool. And I'm really pleased to be able to get another perspective on this now. We're joined live from Washington by Maine's first independent US Senator, Angus King, who, as well as being a leading voice on the importance of improving America's cybersecurity in general, was the co-chairman of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, established by an act of Congress last year. And the commission published its report earlier this year. So I'm delighted that Senator King can join us now to tell us a bit more about it, the recommendations it made, and why it's so important. So welcome to you, Senator. First, could you tell us a little about what the Cyberspace Solarium Commission is and what it aims to do?
Well, as you mentioned, Samara, this was a commission that was set up by the Congress 2 years ago in the National Defense Authorization Act. And the underlying theory was that we needed a comprehensive look at cybersecurity, particularly in light of the numerous attacks that are occurring every day right as we speak. There are attacks going on around the world, and particularly here in the United States. So the commission was established by Congress, signed by the president, and the makeup was a little unusual. There were 4 sitting members of Congress, 4 members from the executive branch, and 6 members from the private sector. We met over 30 times. We had very high attendance. We had an excellent staff, reviewed thousands of pages of documents, I think interviewed 300 or 400 different people, and issued our report, as you mentioned, last March. So the idea was to develop a much more cohesive and comprehensive cyber strategy for the United States, which frankly had been one of the things that we felt had made us vulnerable in this very dangerous age.
And how far have you been able to enact some of the kind of key ideas you wanted? For example, I know you wanted a joint cyber planning cell, to some extent a kind of cybersecurity czar in the White House, obviously funding, a proper strategy. How far along the road are you to having all these different elements to the commission?
Well, I'll bring you up to date on that. But first, let me just, I can give you the essence of the report in 3 words: reorganization, resilience, and response. And in terms of where we are, we had over 50 recommendations. And at this point, we're working to get a number of those recommendations into this year's National Defense Authorization Act, which has now passed both the House and the Senate. We have about a dozen of our recommendations in both the House and the Senate bill. We have another 6 or 8 in the House bill, another dozen in the Senate bill, and we're going through what's now called a conference between the 2 houses to reconcile the differences in the 2 bills. We're very hopeful that we're going to get as many as 20 or perhaps even more of the recommendations actually enacted. That was part of our strategy. That none of us had time to spend hours and hours and hours on a report that wasn't going to have any impact. So we've worked very hard since the issuance of the report to actually put it into practice. And given the fractured nature of the cyber jurisdiction in the U.S. Congress, this hasn't been easy. We've had to get clearances from the Democratic side and the Republican side in numerous committees in order to get to the point where we are now. But we're reasonably optimistic that a lot of our major recommendations will be in the final bill that emerges in the next month or so.
The pandemic will have shaken up a lot of people's assumptions about what is needed. And I wonder what it's taught governments and businesses about preventing and preparing for a kind of serious disruptive cybersecurity event.
Well, I think the most important thing the pandemic has taught us in this area is that the unthinkable can happen. A year ago at this time, none of us on either side of the Atlantic or anywhere in the world were thinking about this worldwide pandemic and the drastic impacts it would have on our society. So that's sort of the first part of our problem is to alert people to how serious the problem is, and that something like a catastrophic cyber attack can occur. We issued a white paper later in the spring about lessons learned from the pandemic, and really some of the strengthening in various areas that we thought were necessary. So, and of course, the pandemic has also made us more vulnerable than ever in terms of our usage of online resources. We never really thought too much about the security of your home router. But if people are working from home, particularly in the defense industry or in more secure environments, that's all of a sudden very important. And the security of the system that you're working with, and all the debate about Huawei, for example, really comes to the fore as this enormous explosion of utilization of the internet has taken place during the pandemic.
You've argued in the Commission's report about layered cyber deterrence and that this should define US cybersecurity strategy. Can you explain briefly what that means?
Well, the key term is deterrence, and frankly, the United States, and I think the West generally, has been what we call over here a cheap date when it comes to cyber attacks. We've allowed a kind of drip of attacks, whether it's the theft of intellectual property, whether it's ransomware, or whether it's direct attacks on our systems, as we have suffered in 2016 in our election and are suffering again this year. So there hasn't been much in the way of response. There have been sort of spotty sanctions and those things. But one of the essential provisions of our report is, number one, we have to shore up resilience. We want the adversary to realize that it probably won't work if we have the proper defenses, but that's not enough. One of our key recommendations is that the adversary has to believe and understand that they will pay a price for attacking us. And that is what has been missing from the cyber strategy for the last decade, if you will. And basically the idea is, and it may not be, for example, cyber to cyber. I know the concept of deterrence in cyber is complicated and somewhat controversial, but the essence is there has to be a response, and the adversary has to know there will be a response. That's what deterrence is all about. If all we do is defend, then they'll come at us. They'll continue to come at us. Why wouldn't they? Because they're not risking paying a price. So layered cyber deterrence starts with resilience, but then it moves on to a response to cyber attacks below the level of a catastrophic attack. I think everybody knows if there's a catastrophic grid attack, for example, there would be a response. But we have to make them pay a price for lesser intrusions. And that's really, I think, one of the most important parts of the report that we recently issued.
Can I ask about corporate responsibility? We're going to be hearing shortly from Brad Smith of Microsoft, and I know that as a company they're great supporters of the Commission's work. How important is partnership between the public and the private sector in fighting cybercrime?
It's absolutely critical. Samara, this is a very unusual challenge in that 85% of the target space in cyber is in the private sector. This is all about cooperation and coordination between the private sector and the governments of the world. And by the way, a lot of additional cooperation and consultation has to take place between friendly governments, between the UK and the US, because this is a global problem. This isn't, a division of the Red Army landing in New Jersey. This is something that's occurring all over the world at the same time. So the collaboration between our countries, but also, and this is really a new kind of thinking, we have to be thinking about new ways to build trust and cooperation and coordination between the government and the private sector, who quite often, frankly, have this kind of wary porcupine kind of relationship. We have to build that trust and confidence so that we can work together. One of our major recommendations that we're working on now to get into the defense bill is continuity of the economy. Over here, we have planning for continuity of government in case of a catastrophic attack. We don't have planning for continuity of the economy. And of course, the economy means the private sector. So your question is absolutely right on the mark, and it's one of the essential challenges that we tried to confront in our report.
My final question, Senator, what do you think the UK can learn from the United States in terms of cybersecurity, and perhaps what could the US learn from what the UK is doing?
Well, I think to go back to what I said before, I think there has to be a very high level of cooperation and coordination as we're learning how to develop a deterrent strategy, for example. I think that's something important. And another of our recommendations, you keep asking the right question. One of our recommendations is an Assistant Secretary of State who's charged with working with the international community on cyber norms and standards, so that this isn't a unilateral country-to-country kind of problem. It's a more universal. We've had 1,000 years to develop the law of war, but we've only had 20 years to develop the law of cyber war, of cyber conflict. And so we need to develop those international norms and standards, and that means working with other countries, providing leadership where necessary, because right now a lot of the Western countries are sort of ceding the field, if you will, to the Chinese, for example, who are very active in the standard setting bodies, the international standard setting bodies. That's where we have to reassert ourselves. And so that's why the cooperation and the instantaneous information sharing is so necessary between our two countries, in particular because of our special relationship, but also the broader community that is trying to build a civilized world. And part of it is dealing with this constant threat, not only from state actors, but from non-state actors, from garden variety criminals. This is something we have a common interest in. And I believe that the relationship that we have with the UK, we can share learnings and share perspectives, and it can be very important in protecting our citizens going forward.
Senator Angus King, an absolute delight to have you share your insights and for making the time to join us here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Samira. Pleasure to be with you.